something we can do about it. That is, we can replace the Articles with the Constitution. And that you can have confidence in your fellow Americans to engage in reflection and choice about what is needed. Now, it is laughably or depressingly easy to show that those actual Americans who were part of the community of active reflection and choice in 1788 were a relatively small minority of all of the Americans. Let's begin with women and slaves, for starters, who were not part of the community who voted for the delegates to the various state conventions. But I'm going to shelve that for now, because I'm not really talking about the circumstance of ratification. Rather, I'm interested in the faith that Hamilton expressed in his fellow Americans, their ability to engage in reflection and choice, and to talk with one another, to be open to argument. I get the title of my book from the end of Federalist 1, where Publius says, I'm going to make arguments open to all. And I'm inviting you as Americans who want only the best for our new country to reflect on my arguments, and I hope that by the end of the Federalist, which will go on for 84 more essays, you'll be persuaded to join in ratifying the new Constitution. My hunch is that if this paragraph were passed out to you without identification of who wrote it, without even saying the President of the Federalist, but I'm just saying, this is a quote written by a famous American during the founding period. Who do you think it was? My hunch is that many of you would say Thomas Jefferson, not Alexander Hamilton, because it seems to bespeak a real faith in the people to engage in reflection and choice. So my question is a very simple question. Do you today have that kind of confidence in your classmates, your friends, and much more importantly, strangers across the country who you've never met, to engage in reflection and choice, especially with regard to something so fundamental as constitutional change? But let me say that the Constitution is only one example of what we might engage in reflection and choice are. We're in a run-up to an election, and the most fundamental question posed by this election, much more so than any other election in my own lifetime, is whether you have faith in your fellow Americans to engage in genuine reflection and choice over who ought to be our president, and therefore to say on November 9th, well, I didn't vote for the winner, but I will respect the outcome because after all, he or she got the relevant votes of enough of my fellow Americans that I'll respect the outcome. I've already suggested that's quite unlikely on November 9th. So I think there's no more important question before us right now than whether or not we believe not merely that we ourselves are capable of reflection and choice, but whether your fellow Americans are capable of reflection and choice. It's not a very hard thing to come to the conclusion, yes, well, I am capable of reflection and choice. I'm a very fine person with very fine values. It's much, much more difficult to come to the conclusion that people you know and don't particularly like, or people you never met and never will meet, are capable of reflection and choice, and that in some sense you ought to be bound by their decision. So then let me turn to the second quote. I won't take the time to read the whole thing aloud, but I will say that the general theme of this quote is also tremendous confidence in the people of America to think for themselves. This is an ode, first of all, to the American Revolution, which overthrew the legitimate government of the United Kingdom, seceded, actually, from the United Kingdom. Most lawyers, most judges, I think it's fair to say, certainly most judges ended up as loyalists, partly because they'd been appointed by the king, but also because they thought that whatever their views about mistakes that the king or parliament might have made, it was a legitimate government, and secession was unwarranted. But Publius, for obvious reasons, celebrates what we might even identify as the audacity of hope. The rejection of tradition, the rejection of what he calls names, that is, famous people or famous leaders who tell you that you have to be satisfied with status quo, and instead having the confidence to learn from our own experience and to act on the basis of what we think necessary. Okay, again, I am not interested in whether you think the American Revolution is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not interested in whether we think the 1787 Constitution in 1787 is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm quite willing to celebrate the framers for stepping up and doing what they thought necessary to save the country. And if forced to it, I'm even willing to offer anguished defenses of the compromises they made, because you do really have to wrestle with, well, what would be the consequence of no constitutional right? That is standing firm against compromise with slavery, or standing firm against the extortionate demand of Delaware for equal representation in the Senate. The response probably would have been either two or three separate countries along the Atlantic coast, and possibly endless warfare. So, be that as it may. What I'm interested is whether this conclusion to Federalist 14 resonates with us in the 21st century as something we can live by. The same thing is true of the Abraham Lincoln quote. That is to say, the Federalist 14 concludes by saying they formed the design of a great confederacy which it is incumbent on their successors to improve and perpetuate. Well, who is this being written to or for? Same thing with Federalist 1. You could say what's being written exclusively to and for the readers in 1787. That's it. If that's the case, then let me say there's no reason for you to read it unless you're an American history buff and want to find out what were they thinking back in 1787. You might be a Renaissance history buff, and if so, you're going to want to read a lot of stuff written in the 16th century. But it won't be because you say, aha, if I spend my time reading this material, I'm going to learn important stuff about what I ought to do today. It's because, and I commend this, I don't criticize it, because you think history is really interesting, it's important to know the past, even if you discover that the past is a very strange country, they do things differently there, and part of the value of history is learning that it's a different country, and that they indeed did things very, very differently. But I say I'm not primarily interested in the historic importance of the Federalists or the historic importance of Abraham Lincoln. I'm interested in whether we read this and say, well, yes, this is speaking across time to me, and it's telling me that I can engage in reflection and choice. It's telling me that one of my duties as a loyal American is not only to perpetuate the constitutional order, but to improve it. And to improve it might require some amendment. It might require perhaps even some relatively drastic changes. But these changes are not for the purpose of destroying our constitutional order, especially if you define the constitutional order in terms of the preamble and the inspiration that I think all of us should get from reading the preamble of the Constitution, because it's the preamble that tells us what the point of this is. The point of the Constitution is not to elect a president. The point of the Constitution is to establish justice, to secure the blessings of liberty, to provide for the common defense, the general welfare. And it's only if you believe that electing presidents or having an electoral college or this, that, or the other is instrumentally useful to achieving the purposes of the preamble that you ought really to support what comes after the preamble. As I say, the central question is, do we read this today merely as ancient history, or do we read it as something that really and truly speaks to us today, even though it was written 225 years ago? Let me conclude by reference to a play, not Richard III, a much more contemporary play, that I will confess that I've become obsessed by. That is Hamilton. I don't know how many of you have listened to the soundtrack. In my own case, I suspect I've listened to it 50 or 60 times. I think it's a remarkable piece of work in every conceivable way. And the central question that I think is asked by Hamilton the play is whether we have anything to learn from Alexander Hamilton in leading our own lives today, or whether it's simply an interesting kind of cultural moment where we have hip-hop and a largely minority cast of characters putting on a costume play, celebrating the framers. Here's Alexander Hamilton, here's George Washington, here's the Marquis de Lafayette, but all they're doing is offering an offbeat take on what happened in 1776, 1787, with no lessons for us. My own view of Hamilton is that it's very much trying to speak to its contemporary audiences, and that what it's trying to say is very, very interesting. Hamilton, and this is a repeated theme. He says this several times. And I'm not throwing away my shot. I am not throwing away my shot. Hey, yo, I'm just like my country. I'm young, scrappy, and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my shot. Do we view ourselves as a young, scrappy, and hungry country? From one perspective, that's crazy. We're not young. We may be scrappy, but we're not young, and it's not clear what it means to say that we're hungry. You know, instead, occasions like today are ostensibly supposed to celebrate these guys, and it is guys, who lived 225, 235 years ago and established something that it's our duty so to continue. I don't think that's quite the message of Hamilton. Just as where the next song concludes with the chorus saying, "Rise up, rise up." Hamilton, John Lawrence, Lafayette, Hercules Mulligan are saying, we're going to rise up. Time to take a shot. We're going to rise up. Time to take a shot. The ensemble is singing, rise up, rise up, rise up, rise up. Okay, what do you learn from listening to that, especially if you listen to it 50 or 60 times? do you say, well, isn't it wonderful that they rose up in 1776 and that they rose up in 1787? But God knows we can't think of rising up because our duty is simply to celebrate and perpetuate what they wrote in Philadelphia. Or is it legitimate to take from what they did that we ought to think for ourselves the way they thought for themselves? In no way do I want to bash the founders, because it does seem to me, well, no way is a little excessive. We're not talking about slavery. But what I do want to say is that the founders are a genuine source of inspiration because they thought for themselves and they acted by themselves. They rose up and radically transformed the world. And so the question is, well, is our duty not merely to honor them,